Here at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia, home to one of the two Avro VZ-9 flying cars, also known as a flying saucer. Here at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia. Going to be examining some UFO history here at the museum. So this is the Cold War room in the museum. Its theme is experimental and unconventional vehicles, small tactical personal movers, and equipment used in Antarctic research. Since Fort Eustis was the headquarters of the U.S. Army's Transportation Corps, many prototype vehicles were flown and tested here. It's also why the museum has a large number of experimental craft in its collection. And this is the perfect place to examine the U.S. government's and the military's response to UFO sightings. The two artifacts in the museum which figure into UFO history are the Avrocar VZ-9, nicknamed the Flying Saucer for obvious reasons, and the Bell AeroSystems jetpack, which was featured in an episode of the popular sitcom Gilligan's Island that used a UFO sighting for comic relief. In fact, both the jetpack and the Avrocar were also featured in a CBS News special report with Walter Cronkite, which aired in 1966 called UFO, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy. This CBS News item is generally considered to be a debunking effort backed by the CIA. A letter in the Smithsonian Institution archives explains the ulterior motives for the documentary. The letter from an astronomer, Dr. Thornton Page, to Fred Durant, the then assistant director of the National Air and Space Museum, exposes the ruse. Both Page and Durant were part of a team of scientists in 1953 called the Robertson Panel, which was set up by the CIA to strip UFOs of the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired. In the letter, Dr. Page explains that they used the Robertson Panel guidelines to steer the direction of the CBS News documentary. Page appears in the news report as a scientific expert. This CBS News documentary used footage of both the Avro car and the Bell AeroSystems jetpack as examples of unusual aircraft designs the U.S. Air Force proposed might be mistaken for a UFO. Avrocar VZ-9 AV artifact. This access panel from the top side of the flying saucer allowed engineers to access the inner workings of the car. And here's another artifact in the museum that figures into UFO history. It's a jetpack developed by Bell AeroSystems. The jetpack was used in an episode of Gilligan's Island, in which Gilligan flies the jetpack in an attempt to get rescued and is mistaken for a UFO by the US Navy, which is nearby. The castaways had intended to use the jetpack for their rescue. However, Gilligan fumbles it once again. Gilligan's Island, episode title, It's a Bird, It's a Plane. Season 3, episode 27. Broadcast date, March 27th, 1967. In the opening scene, which takes place not on Gilligan's Island, the title card is shown over a film of stock footage of a Bell AeroSystems jetpack test. A colonel is briefing a general to see if they will authorize the jetpack for official U.S. Air Force use. Testing is going on in the Pacific, and this jetpack, which they call the XJP, will make all other jetpacks obsolete. It's compact, lightweight, anybody can operate it, and it's got a range of 500 miles. A lieutenant enters and relays a message from the test ship in the Pacific. The XJP is lost at sea. They don't want it to fall into the wrong hands, so the military is going to search for it. The general says the XJP reminds him of Buck Rogers. Of course, Gilligan finds the jetpack on the island and argues with the skipper whether or not the jetpack belongs to Buck Rogers. The professor studies the jetpack. The Howells and the girls separately try to trick Gilligan to fly the XJP to Hawaii so the castaways can be rescued. The professor wants to send a dummy with a note. Gilligan sets off the jetpack, which flies around the lagoon, wasting most of the jet fuel. The professor determines that there is enough fuel to send somebody straight up for a short hop. They do astronaut-type training to determine who will go up. Again, of course, it's Gilligan. He doesn't want to go, but they talk him into it. He launches and they cut to actual footage of a jetpack in flight with an actual test pilot wearing a costume-like red shirt, just like Gilligan's. The footage, apparently made just for this production, was filmed somewhere with pine trees and no palm trees. Quite probably at Fort Eustis. Bell Labs and the military clearly cooperated with the episode and provided use of an actual jetpack flown by a test pilot as a stunt double for Gilligan. So Gilligan finally goes up. He has the professor's radio and can hear the Navy is searching for the XJP. He says, "I'm a bird, I'm a plane, I'm Super Gilligan," a reference to the Superman TV show and the title of this episode. Then he hears that the Navy has spotted a UFO. He gets scared and goes into a cloud. The exhaust from the XJP causes it to rain and the Navy calls off the search. Later, the professor tells Gilligan that he was the UFO, to which Gilligan asks if he was from Mars or from Venus. The takeaways from this episode: there are a lot of science fiction references to Buck Rogers and Superman. Buck Rogers dealt with themes of alien civilizations, and Superman himself was an alien. The stock footage at the beginning of this episode is in black and white and shows real-life footage of the Bell AeroSystems jetpack being tested. The test pilot flies over a World War II era minesweeper with the hull number 305. That can be identified as the USS Spectacle. which was decommissioned in 1945 and likely ended up in the U.S. Navy's reserve fleet in the James River, also known as the Ghost Fleet. This fleet is just off of Fort Eustis. So it is likely that the stock footage used in this episode of Gilligan's Island was filmed at Fort Eustis. Also noteworthy in this sitcom episode is that original footage was created with a test pilot dressed in Gilligan's red signature shirt. So here's an exclusive. For a long time, the location of the Army's Avrocar prototype, which used to be on display at the museum, was seemingly unknown. Its location couldn't be pinned down. The current director of the U.S. Army Transportation Museum has informed me that a chunk of the Army's Avrocar currently rests under this riser, below that weird contraption called the AeroCycle. And I took some footage and I'll show that to you. Some of the rib struts, and not really sure if the fan is in there. So a large portion of the Avrocar is still here at Fort Eustis. The other portions are apparently been shipped to Anniston Army Depot, where the museum keeps their surplus collection. So this is pretty cool here. This is part of the Avrocar, the VZ-9, and it's underneath one of the other exhibits in the Cold War experimental room. Back in the 1970s and 80s, the Avro car was on static display outside the museum here. The entire car was on display, actually. And then, for a time period, it went into storage. But Fort Eustis is the home of one of the Avro cars, otherwise known as a flying saucer, built and developed by the US government and the Pentagon.